These stark and frankly rather disturbing photographs of the aftermath of the fall of Monte Cassino were taken by Major George Peel, Military Cross and Bar, 392 Battery Commander, 98th Field Regiment, Royal Artillery. The devastation is complete, more total even than that evident in much of the familiar footage of bombed out German cities in 1945. Allied trucks and a motorcycle can be seen passing an unrecognisable building here. It is what is left of the Palazzo Barone in Cassino. More transport moved through the destruction in the shadow of Monte Cassino and the mountain ridge. And here, visible through the broken trees, is the remains of the town of Cassino, and through the haze, the ridge behind it. The Yanks' $1 million ridge, as Bombardier John Gascoigne Pease, a 22-year-old in Major Peel's troop, wrote to Riley in his diary in February 1944, musing that they were stuck in the coldest spot in Italy. On the 15th of February, Gascoigne Pease wrote simply, 140 fortresses bombed the monastery this morning. We saw it. This picture shows another of the 98th Field Regiment's young bombardiers, Jimmy Stevenson at 471 Battery Command Post in action on the 1st of May 1944. Oh, that's the preview. Okay, there was supposed to be a picture of Jimmy Stevenson up there. In the photo, the mountain can be seen looming behind him and he's drinking from a mess tin. And on the 30th of May, he wrote, I shall feel more satisfied when the damage our shells inflict is displayed on German property, not these poor Italian houses and farmsteads. But it can't be helped. It's heartbreaking to witness some of these villages just after we've shelled the enemy out of them, and to see the half-starved civilians coming back from the caves in the hills to find their homes in ruins. A month or so later, in early July, as they advanced beyond Rome and towards Florence, Stevenson noted that the Italians had become friendlier towards them, and that there was now a very marked hatred for the Germans. He wrote to his father that he'd never believed the stories of atrocities in Russia that they'd read about in the British Army newspaper. They'd assumed it must be Soviet propaganda. But the battery came to a village and found the smouldering remains of its young women who'd been burnt in the village square. They had refused to be taken as sex slaves. This incomprehensible scene would have been witnessed by my own grandfather, Sergeant Charlie Howard. He served in the same troop as Jimmy Stevenson. A few lines further on, Stevenson writes the rather desperately detached words, apart from all this, life is pretty good. It is interesting, given these tragic events are recorded without the benefit of any hindsight or broader view than their own corner of the battlefield, that Stevenson is in no doubt as to who he blames. Hitler personally, and not the German people. He states bluntly, they are now fighting a new generation of German soldier who have only known the indoctrination of Hitler's Nazi state. Put very simply, Italy was caught between the heart-rending destruction recorded by Major Peel's photos as liberation was wrought by the shells and massed aerial bombardment of the Allies, and the forlorn horror recorded by Bombardier Stevenson. Examples of cold-blooded cruelty, he wrote later in July, which are increasing daily now and make your blood boil. That previous photo, on a lighter note, was of the British making tea. It was actually taken in North Africa as the regiment prepared to invade Sicily, but it is very clear from all letters and diaries that more tea was drunk in Italy during 1944 than in the rest of the country's history put together. My grandfather explained to us when we were teenagers how they had invented a contraption they named the Benghazi boiler, a sealed container of petrol with a hole punched in its side was set to boil over a fire. You then cooked or made tea over the roaring jet of flame that blazed out of the punctured hole. Despite telling us that the British Army had banned the device in an early example of health and safety overreaction, my brother and I decided to make a miniature version in his bedroom using a glass methylated spirits bottle and a child's chemistry set burner while my mother was out. We nearly burned the house down. This photo is one my grandfather simply labels home. And I think sometimes when I've read in these letters about Italian families will willingly give up their beds for the soldiers as they come through and make everybody at home, this is what my grandfather would have been sleeping in for the majority of the campaign throughout the winters, like putting the war and the bombs aside. I can't imagine anything more horrific than a camping trip that continues for 6 years, but that's what he labelled home. This photo shows 392 Battery's position at Cassino. Camouflage webbing draped over the barrel of one of their guns, top right, and in the centre, one of their forward observation post vehicles, a Sherman tank with a dummy wooden gun and a large wireless box behind the turret, maximising the room for maps inside. The months that had been endured attempting to dislodge the Germans from their defensive line is well illustrated by this picture from Major Peel. A Panther tank turret built onto a bunker, and here we see the same type of turret actually atop a knocked-out Panther. Amidst all this horror and destruction, however, it is very important to emphasise that tales of humanity, dignity, and overwhelming generosity from Italy's civilian population shine through the letters, diaries, and photographs of these young British soldiers. Jimmy Stevenson, a grammar school boy from a successful business family, and perhaps a little reserved and rather English, wrote in October 1944, "The Italians can teach us something about hospitality. It is overwhelming at times and embarrassing. I've seen whole families weeping sometimes when we leave a position that we've only been in a week because they've got so attached to 3 or 4 fellows who have gone into their home every evening." One has to wonder, of course, whether these Italian families were in part weeping for their own missing young men. This photo is actually taken at the beginning of the Italian campaign in Sicily. I love the expression on the Sicilian gentleman's face, the smiling children, and the little boy saluting Major Peel as he takes the photograph. The British officer looking towards the camera is Captain Oscar Browning. He lost his life only a few weeks later in southern Italy, not in combat, but to polio in an outbreak of the disease that struck several of the members of the regiment, killing 2 of them. With one such family, and the scarcity of food available to the Italian population cannot be overemphasised here, Jimmy Stevenson writes that food was eaten once a day, starting at 11 in the morning, and generally consisted of a terrific bowl of macaroni and tomatoes. Any British soldier who strayed into the kitchen was whipped into a chair by one of the women of the house, and before he could say a word, an enormous plate of this pasta and a glass of wine would appear in front of him. Just as he thought he was finished, 3 or 4 more ladles would be dished out, and that was him useless for the rest of the day. Pictured here, their battery commander, Major Ken Payne, MC, appeared at the farmhouse looking for the command post officer one morning, and they playfully told him he was to be found in the kitchen. Payne reappeared an hour later, much to his men's amusement, holding his stomach. Major Payne is pictured again here, the right-hand figure sitting on the Sherman, in a picture taken by my grandfather. The photograph was incorrectly labelled by him when he put his album of wartime photographs together 40 years later, but a strong candidate for the date and location is the crossing of the River Melfa in May 1944, just after Cassino. Two of the 471 battery self-propelled guns are to their left. We now jump back to the very start of the Italian campaign, July 1943 in Sicily. I did not have these next photographs when I spoke in Catania last year, but I believe they are too significant not to show here now today, and illustrate why so many of these observation post officers and men were decorated with awards for bravery. These are the Reitano and Di Stefano farm buildings, the epicentre of the Primosole Bridge battlefield on the north bank of the River Someto, scene of the fiercest battle in the Sicilian campaign, incurring large numbers of casualties on both sides. The photo was taken during the week following the battle and looks south towards the river. During the battle, the Germans were principally to the north, slightly behind the photographer, and the British guns were beyond the ridge in the far distance, some 4 or 5 kilometres away to the south. On the left are the ruins of the Reitano barn, and behind it, in the centre, the Reitano farmhouse with the damaged gable. As well as being a unique photograph of the location, it was not taken by an anonymous photographer or an army film unit, but by a central participant, Major George Peel, at this point still a captain. He labels his photograph "Roadblock at which enemy tank appeared and was engaged with shell fire." He was artillery forward observation officer during the height of the fighting. He and his party had been located at the farmhouse, only 500 metres back from the final position of the German counterattack of tanks and infantry, which was halted by a barrage of the entire 50th Division's guns, about 150 artillery pieces, which had been called in by himself, only 500 metres away. Inevitably, some of the shells fell in the area of the observation post. Peel and his party astoundingly escaped unscathed, but some of the Durham Light Infantry outside were not so lucky and were caught by stray shells, something Major Peel would have felt very closely, himself also being from County Durham, and he marks their loss poignantly in his photograph album. Peel won the first of his 2 military crosses for his valour that day. This same photograph, same observation post building looking in the other direction to the north. For those like myself who have a particular interest in the events surrounding the Battle of Primosole Bridge, this photograph is fascinating. It shows the observation post party of Captain Bob Pike, MC, camouflaging an Italian Saharan AS-42 patrol car, captured from the Italian 10th Arditi Commandos during their courageous raid against the British front line on the eve of the battle. Captain Pike's own vehicle, a honey tank, was destroyed during the incident and can be seen along with the burnt-out wrecks of some of the other AS-42 cars in the well-known film footage of the aftermath of the Arditi raid. Captain Pike is sitting on top and won the Military Cross for his efforts in Sicily. Gunner Charlie Chandler, on the right, fired the honey tank's Browning machine gun on the approaching Arditi commandos at Primosole. He was killed 2 months later when his feet were blown off by an anti-tank mine. Gunner Gadsby, on the left, was killed at Cassino. Finally, these are the 4 young men upon whose first-hand accounts, letters, diaries, and photographs capturing how they felt and what was actually important to them on the days and in the moments that the events actually happened, this presentation has been based. Top left is George Peel. He started the war as second lieutenant, was at Dunkirk, won the Military Cross twice as forward observation officer, and had attained the rank of Major by September 1943. Bottom left is John Gascoigne Pease. Quickly promoted from gunner to bombardier, he looked up to Major Peel, who he credited with saving them on the beach at Dunkirk through his example and leadership. The regiment had been ordered to hold the rear line at Dunkirk to the last man or last round, while the rest of the army was evacuated. Half the regiment's strength became casualties. Jimmy Stevenson is top right, an articulate, intelligent young man who resented the rigid class system endemic in the regiment and whose letters are an incredible record of their war. Lastly, bottom right is my grandfather, Charlie Howard. He got left behind at Dunkirk, made his way across enemy-occupied France to Brittany, taking 6 weeks, and managed to get a passage to Liverpool. By the time of the Italian campaign, he'd been promoted to sergeant and won the military medal near Bologna in December 1944 at the observation post. His citation describes him as time and again displaying valour beyond praise. On this occasion, he was trying unsuccessfully to rescue his badly injured best mate, Bombardier Reggie Keast, under machine gun fire. A poignant postscript to the incident is that even at this late stage of the war, there was still some humanity, however. The Germans had found Keast, and they troubled to fire a propaganda shell over to the British lines with a note inside to say that he was receiving medical treatment. Given the horrendous experience that Italy was for all concerned, and not least for the German defenders who continually suffered appalling casualties as they withdrew, it is inevitable that I should sum up on a sombre note, and will leave you with the final thoughts on the 98th Field Regiment's Italian campaign of another of their troop captains, Tom Davis, MC, who wrote their official history many years later. Italy had taken much from the regiment. Too many white crosses marked the graves of its dead, and too many hospital beds were filled with its wounded. What she had given in return was harder to say. Looking back, it was natural that thoughts should be tinged with disappointment. The campaign had been hard fought, unsatisfying, and too often unsung. Hopes had been so high as the regiment had crossed the Messina Straits in September 1943. Such great things were going to be achieved. But one by one, those hopes had died in the mud of the Moreau, amidst the desolation of Cassino, and on the snow-covered heights of the Apennines. Grazie a tutti. Thank you, everyone.